welcome. Yes, so we're on our fourth class, so second last class of this course. So it's a nice short course, Becoming Your Best Self. And we've had quite an adventure over the previous classes, tackling some really big picture ways of putting our life in perspective. You know, the first class about happiness. What is happiness? How we're striving for it. We can't even put our finger on what it is. And if we are able to stop and pause, how we notice that the most satisfying sense of happiness, contentment, joy, inspiration comes from within, not just from consuming things externally or just arranging ourselves, making everything more comfortable. But yet when we look at the ratio, how much time or energy we spend on the external things and our comfort levels, and how much of a ratio we spend on the state of our mind, doesn't quite match up, does it? So the type of contentment or satisfaction that comes from the senses is very fleeting, but the type of real sense of satisfaction that comes from sharing with others, looking after others, being deeply involved in something, especially something virtuous that will bring long-term happiness, it's far more long-lasting. And eventually, as we develop, we attain realizations, we develop our heart, we develop our resilience, and that's a kind of peace of mind that comes from within and is not circumstantial. So no matter what happens to us, we're protected. Then we've also looked at the worldly concerns, the 8 worldly dharmas, as they're called, or the unstable preoccupations that we have, how our mind gets sucked into these competition and status, avoiding anything uncomfortable, just wanting to be comfortable, craving people to acknowledge us and think of us well and nicely, so avoiding any form of conflict, and then probably avoiding fixing things. So all of these worldly or unstable concerns, they really corrupt our good intentions. They corrupt our good-heartedness. And so they destroy our happiness, our long-term happiness, that we can get really sucked into them. So the first step with those, of course, is to just notice that they're there and at play, and tell them, back in your box. And then last week we looked at what are called the 3 higher trainings. So these are 3 skills that don't necessarily come naturally. They're skills that we have to train in to learn. So ethics, concentration, and wisdom. And so you remember the picture of a person chopping a banana tree at the root, you know, chopping a tree at the root. So we want to cut the root of suffering. We don't want to have to deal with every single suffering as it comes along. We'll be here forever. We want to cut the root of suffering, cut the root of problems, the very cause of it, so that we don't have to experience problems anymore. So what cuts it? It's the wisdom realizing emptiness, or in colloquial terms, understanding reality, not being confused anymore. So that's the axe that cuts the root of suffering. But what holds the axe? 2 strong arms. And we can't be like on Funniest Home Videos where we just fall over, you know, and hurt ourselves or hurt somebody else. And those 2 strong arms are concentration, being able to focus and hold our mind on a topic that we decide, without getting too tight, without burning out, without stressing, without getting exhausted, actually with more relaxation and more clarity. And that's also a skill that we can learn, and something that's so important, because we have less and less concentration as we have more and more social media, because our attention's just captured all the time. And what is the support for our concentration is ethics, and that's the body. We embody our ethics, and that's where we can start. That's the easy place to start. We have to actually embody our ethics. As they say, walk the talk. Because if we just say, oh, I believe in this, but we do something contradictory, we won't sit well in our own skin, and our entire path will be weak and unstable. So luckily, ethics is something fairly straightforward if we really take it on board and we act not according to social pressures, but according to our conscience, our sense of care for others, our wisdom, our virtue. And then even when things go wrong, we'll feel stable, and we also become less fearful. So with the ethics, did anyone and these 3 higher trainings, did anyone have a go at the homework that I finally got to you? Either with the shopping. Did anyone have a go with shopping? Christy, did you have a go?
Well, you know, I've been researching and working on my book, and we also have COVID going on, so I actually haven't bought anything.
Oh, okay. So no online buying anything?
I haven't been out.
Oh.
Well, no, I did. I bought a book that you had recommended just this morning.
Okie dokie. Excellent.
Yeah.
So even when we're doing online
and I didn't even think about that.
The book, you know, every time you see a book, you can think, don't judge a book by its cover. There's the cover, it's presenting something, and I believe it immediately. So if you just, you know, then you can start using every time you see a book, your wisdom clicks in. Don't grasp at inherent existence. Don't grasp at the judging a book by its cover. Just have that little question in your mind, and then it'll kick off really well.
Well, you said it was a good book, so that's what I'm judging it by.
Oh, okay.
Guess I'm grasping at my teacher.
And what about ethics? So there was one about observing your motivation and kind of adjusting your motivation. Did anyone have a go at that? Making it kind of personal? All too shy to say? Well,
oh, I know. You're talking about the bottom third of the worksheet, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that was really nice. You know, what I really appreciated was I have really poor self-esteem, and I tend to be super hypercritical of myself. And I actually really enjoyed spending 2 full minutes appreciating my efforts and rejoicing in them.
How fantastic. Now that makes me happy. That really makes me happy. Because I know where you're coming from. I know that the momentum of that hypercritical kind of thing. And it's kind of like discriminating awareness run rampant. So we need that discrimination. That's a real skill, but we've got to master it. We can't have it run rampant and dominate us. Right. So, you know, there's a good part to it. We don't want to chuck that out, because it can be a real skill to see that amount of detail and be that particular, but it's got to be supported with kindness.
Yeah, self-compassion. Yeah.
So we are going to continue on with a theme with that. So I'll just get our screen share up. Becoming our best self. Why are we here? So today we're going to have a look how to listen to your hidden wisdom, the hidden wisdom that is there in our experience of stress, boredom, anxiety, and depression. So normally when we have experience like that, it feels bad, and so we just want to get rid of it. So there's actually a huge amount of hidden wisdom in there. So how to listen to it, how to find that kernel of wisdom. So within that, we're going to have a look at breaking the toxic depression cycle, some radical cures from the Buddha. I mean, there are many cures out there, and methods and self-help things and psychological whatever, but the Buddha's answer to breaking the depression cycle is radical, and it's dynamite. And also how to break the habit of worry. So throughout my life, you know, whenever I've seen Lamzo Rinpoche, you know, every couple of years he would come to Australia and maybe we'd be able to, you know, say hello and spend like 10 minutes with Rinpoche or something like that, ever since I was a very small girl. And every time without fail, he'd say, Miffy, don't you worry. Because he could see I'm always worried, continuously anxious, worried about everything. He'd say, Miffy, don't you worry, every single time. And honestly, that was the thing I held on to, just Rinpoche saying, don't worry. I didn't know how to stop worrying. I didn't know any of that, but at least that it was okay to want to stop worrying. Anyway, finally, over the years, I've been able to figure out how to work with it. So hopefully I can share some of this with you. So let's just take a moment to set our motivation for today then. Let's see. Oh, Christy, I'm just going to mute you because there's a little bit of feedback. So for our motivation, you know, we've got the two wings of the bird, wisdom and compassion, but a more colloquial way that we can think of it is curiosity and kindness. So with a sense of kindness for ourselves and others, you know, we expect so much of ourselves, we expect so much of others, and yet, you know, we can get quite impatient and we can get quite demoralized about things. So taking it a gear lower, just slowing things down, and remembering a sense of kindness, that none of us wants to suffer, and we all long for peace, happiness, safety, meaning, all of these things. And yet sufferings pour down on us like, you know, like a huge storm, a rainfall of problems. And so to allow ourselves to feel a sense of kindness and compassion and warmth and affection towards others who are just like us, and the same attitude to ourselves, because many times the way that we talk to ourselves, we'd never talk to anybody else like that. And then a sense of curiosity, which takes some big-heartedness as well, courage, inquisitiveness, a real liking to learn things that we don't know, instead of feeling demoralized about things that we don't know. To once we discover something we don't know, goody, goody, goody. If we nurture this sense of curiosity, it means we can nurture our wisdom, but it's informed by joy, by the joy of discovery. And then that way our wisdom can only grow and it can sustain us. And what motivates both of these two things is the big-hearted attitude that it's not just for us, but it's for everybody. We're here for everyone. You know, we need a peaceful world. We need everybody else to be peaceful and happy too, if we want to feel peaceful and happy and safe. And when we think about it, everybody is just like us. And here we are with this amazing window of opportunity. We may not feel like that, but this is it. We have this window of opportunity to do something really profound with our life and affect our own heart and those of all others in a very long-term manner. So we can even set our motivation all the way up to liberation from suffering and full enlightenment, so we can help everybody else as well. So with that motivation, then let's have a look at what causes us to crash, to become demoralized, to lose our energy. And many times we don't kind of realize anything's gone wrong until we have an experience of depression or anxiety. And then because of our worldly concerns, because it feels bad, then we think it is bad and we try and get rid of it. We try and get rid of that feeling of depression or that feeling of anxiety, thinking that it's bad for us. And actually that makes it stronger. And we'll see why over this week and next week. But quite a few years ago now, when His Holiness the Dalai Lama came to Brisbane, and one of the public talks, somebody asked His Holiness about, what's the cure for depression? And His Holiness gave this really interesting answer, which started at the very, very basic level of our physical circumstances, and then worked more and more subtle to deep internal karmic causes. And his approach was start pretty much with the most obvious, the easiest things, and then slowly work to the deeper causes. But he also said that because depression and anxiety are actually symptoms of having disturbing emotions and of being out of step with reality, there are many causes. And because there are many causes, there's no one cure. There are many different methods to approach. And we've got to find for ourselves what are our causes of depression and anxiety, and they may be quite different from others. So this is different from, say, when we talk about the afflictive emotions like attachment, jealousy, hatred. They're universal. They're not cultural things, they're universal. And when we experience them, we can identify them, and they have specific cures that we can actually remove them. So it's quite a different approach. So what I wanted to do was to show you this from a Western point of view, which is very much in sync to what His Holiness's answer was. Causes for depression and anxiety. So first off, to look at organic causes. So we might have changes in brain chemistry. So you might have PMT, or you might have, postnatal depression. You might be going through menopause. You might have an acquired brain injury. You might live in a toxic environment where you're slowly being poisoned by pollution from a smelting factory next door. You might just have a really terrible diet. Like me, and be slightly malnourished and just rely on the kindness of others to keep you nourished. Just think about sugar for a moment. You have a sugar rush and then you have a sugar crash. And when that's happening, it's all encompassing. You can really think that you're bemoaning the state of the world, but actually what's happening is an organic sugar crash. All we have to do is look at kiddies at a birthday party, and when you hear the sound of the excitement getting higher and higher, and any moment there's going to be tears. So this is the first place to start. Look at what's physically happening, your diet, your environment. If you've got a brain tumor, if it's a toothache, these things that we can very quickly identify and do something about. So if it's not that, then the next thing is to look at, well, what's been happening? Response to events. So often if we live in a violent household, for instance, we might get used to it, but then we kind of realize, oh, other households aren't like this. So if you do live in a violent or aggressive environment, or your workplace is violent or aggressive, then it's natural to have depression and anxiety. It's probably indicating the level of violence or aggression. We may be feeling helpless. So if you're in an old people's home and you don't have much agency, you can't really determine what's going to happen to you each day. Or if you're in lockdown and your ability to go out and distract yourself is curtailed. That feeling of helplessness, not so much the isolation, but the recognition that we are not in control. If we're not prepared for that, if we're grasping at permanence and grasping at the external things like that, then of course depression and anxiety will happen. And it could be something like a death in the family, or we're thinking about climate change, you know, about actual really traumatic events. Losing one's job. Negative habit patterns is the next level. So, you know, with the response to events, there is a, in our culture, there is a degree where we accept people, say, being in mourning, or accept people being depressed about lockdown or whatever. And then after a certain amount of time, people say, oh, it's time to get over it now. And that is an arbitrary time. And that changes depending for what culture it is, depending on what issue of the psychiatry manual you're looking at. And that's actually a very individual thing. But what is a deeper level than that? If we're still looking and going, well, I can't really put my finger on anything here, rather than feeling, well, it's not legitimate what I'm feeling, to look deeper. And so we look at negative habit patterns. And a lot of our depression and anxiety is just powered by the momentum of being used to being depressed and anxious. It's like a self-propelling thing. So for instance, if as a child you actually were neglected, you know, you have that trauma within you, you have that cycle of events where you're neglected. And then now as an adult, you decide to meet someone for coffee or have a Zoom meeting, and you get there and you're all organized and they don't show up. So what happens? You're thrown way back to that first experience as a child again, and you have this incredibly huge traumatic response. And the whole cycle perpetuates itself immediately. And we forget we're an adult. We have all of these emotional resources at our disposal. We have the wealth of the Dharma to call on right then. We have our Sangha brothers and sisters. We have each other, but we forget. It's the last thing that we think of, that we have people around us who are kind and genuinely care about us, that we can ask for help, because we become that past traumatized child again. So what drives that is the strength of the habit, the momentum of the habit. It's just run out of control with us. And what drives those habit patterns are afflictive states of mind. So afflictive emotions, jealousy, hatred, you know, that comes from aversion, dissatisfaction, craving, pride, which can be arrogance or it can be self-contempt. But either way, it's an extreme view of oneself, pride or inverted pride. So all of those afflictive states of mind, now they're more tricky to recognize. But we know we have afflictive states of mind because we feel unhappiness. So this is the thing, that depression, stress, and anxiety are symptoms of disturbing emotions. They're not the cause of our disturbing emotions. They're actually, our depression and anxiety is evidence that something's wrong. And because there are many of the disturbing emotions, we've got to look at which is the one that's actually causing our depression and anxiety. It might be pride. It might be that, you know, everybody else has got academic degrees and I have nothing. It might be dissatisfaction. We're just focusing on everything out there, trying to find satisfaction, and it's like drinking that salt water, you know, we're less and less satisfied. It might be real resentment and hatred towards someone. So we have to look within ourselves, be quite honest, to see what of the afflictive mind states, the afflictive emotions, is it that is our that is really driving this whole cycle, and the result is depression and anxiety. So often what happens is we don't know what's going on in our mind. We just think everything's fine, and then we get depressed or we get anxious, and then we think that is the problem. But it's like having the flu. When you have the flu and you start getting the achy bones and the fever, if you just think, oh, okay, just take painkillers and I'll be fine. If you just keep on taking painkillers, even down the bottom, it says, if pain persists, see your doctor, because getting rid of the pain isn't the thing. Actually, the pain is telling you something's wrong. Back pain is telling you something is wrong. Back pain isn't the problem. It's evidence of the problem. And actually, it's our friend. Because if we don't pay attention to the back pain, we keep on doing whatever it is that's causing it, and then we can do a really serious injury. And this is what happens with depression and anxiety. We just try and get rid of that bad feeling. We just take whatever the pain, the existential painkillers are, until something breaks, until we have a nervous breakdown. And then it's so much more difficult to put the pieces together. So actually, just like when you have a fever, it's evidence that your immune system is actually kicking in, is actually trying to deal with the virus. Depression and anxiety are like that fever. It's the immune system of your mind kicking in, trying to deal with something that is going wrong. So we have to look at what's going wrong. So this way, just like a fever, pain, our pain system keeps us safe. Our anxiety and depression are actually our friend, because they indicate something is wrong and this is where to look. So we get our own specific, tailored prescription. Look here. So it's quite a different way of looking at things, isn't it? And this is why it's worth having an understanding about those worldly concerns, because it's those 8 worldly concerns, and in particular, avoiding the unpleasant and gravitating towards the pleasant, that really catches us up, because it means that we avoid the causes of depression and anxiety. We just try and make ourselves feel better, and it actually makes it worse. We're actually avoiding the cure then. So before we go on, questions or comments, please, if there's anything at all. Does it make sense to you? Yeah, okie dokie. Yep, Jennifer.
It makes sense. It makes sense. Unfortunately, I have, I'm in all those categories that you mentioned, the 4 categories. I've got a little bit of all of it, except maybe the first one, because I've actually changed my entire diet recently.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm dipping my toes in all that.
Yeah, so this is a really good to notice, Jennifer, because if you objectively see, oh my gosh, I'm in all of those 4 categories, then the only possible response that you can have is to be kind. You've got to be kind to yourself. You know, because there's the evidence, right? So to not be impatient with yourself, to give yourself some room, and to in a way, we can treat ourselves as invalids, you know, how we would treat someone who is sick. We don't expect a huge amount, come on, get it together, suck it up, all of that kind of stuff. That's actually very unkind. So let's have a look then. We're going to have a little bit about the depression side of things, and then a little bit about the anxiety side of things. So this slide, actually, the causes for depression and anxiety, from a Western point of view, it's the first 3: organic causes, responses to events, and the kind of the negative habit patterns, the self-perpetuating negative cycles. And there are Western psychological methods to deal with these, but actually it's just from the Buddhist point of view that we see what's driving these is the afflictive states of mind, those afflictive emotions. They're the actual driver. They're the disease. The depression and anxiety is the symptom. And then it's just from the the Buddhist point of view, that we can look even deeper than that of, well, what drives the afflictive emotions, which is that, the mistaken grasping at inherent existence, our mistaken and out of step with reality. Now, let's have a look, listening to depression. And here is an interesting fact, that neurologically, there is no difference between sadness and depression. So this is shocking, isn't it? I mean, we have in our mind, we differentiate between the two. And so, some of the differences between depression and sadness, I mean, one of them is that with sadness, often we can identify the cause of it. Somebody died, my cat died, for instance, and I'm sad. And so because of that, it feels more legitimate. Whereas often with depression, if we can't say, oh, it's because of this, we feel a bit guilty or a bit stupid or illegitimate. So if we can't identify a cause. Also now, there is something, depression, we kind of think it's a bad thing. Whereas sadness, is there a space for sadness in life? Is there something that's meaningful about it? So, what is it that we'd go, that sadness is worth it? Why? What happens with sadness? Shayla, you were nodding. What do you reckon?
I think sadness is acceptable, and depression, for me, or is not acceptable. It's taboo. It's okay to be sad, but it's not okay to have depression. Buck up,
Yeah, that's right. So why is it okay to be sad? What is it? Like, or say, even just taking, say, with grief, if we're grieving something, what is it about grieving that makes it okay?
I think, sadness doesn't last for very long. I don't know, for me at least.
Yeah, sadness can be like a process. Mm. So there's some things, and yeah, so the neurological thing where, if you're looking at what's happening in the brain, no difference between sadness and depression. So what's going on here? So one of the things with grief or sadness, when we're grieving, we actually naturally develop a sense of empathy. So, if my cat dies and I feel so brokenhearted, then later on, when somebody else is crying about their pet dying and feeling like a real idiot, like it's just an animal, why am I so upset? I didn't even cry, when my father died, but here I'm crying when my dog's dying. We know how they feel, and our heart just opens because we've had that experience ourselves. We know what it's like. So we naturally develop a sense of empathy. And what's happened, say, for instance, with COVID, either it's closed us down or it's opened our heart. So often the first time that we experience grief is the first time that we notice other people experience grief. Before that, we've been oblivious. So here we are, say, in lockdown with COVID, it's the first time we've experienced enforced isolation. But, then we can think about it. Wow, I'm thinking of the kids here, that are all in lockdown at the moment. They can't go to school and everyone's going, oh, it's going to ruin everyone's childhood. But actually, it can make you think there's a whole enormous amount of children around the world that live like this normally. And it's only when it happens to us that we notice. Before that, it didn't even figure on my mind. So it can really make us develop genuine empathy and compassion. And so then we can become a better person. And because grief or sadness, it's acceptable and we let ourselves go through it, then this natural process happens. Our heart naturally opens instead of closing down. Grief and sadness also makes us more connected. So, it's like if you've ever broken your ankle or something, and you never noticed anybody, you never noticed anyone with a broken bone until you break your own, and then suddenly you look around and everyone's broken their ankle. It's like, wow, how did everyone break their ankle all in the same month? But no, it's because now we're noticing it. And so what happens is who we think of as our people becomes bigger. We become more connected to the world. And we have seen this with COVID as well, haven't we? With natural disasters, we feel more connected rather than more isolated, because we know people are in the same boat as us. And as we go through this, then when we come out the other side, as time heals all wounds, time really does change the experience of things. We gain a little bit more strength, then we're able to help others. Then, all it takes when we're in a terrible spot is for someone to say, I know what you're going through. I've been there. And just knowing that you have company, that someone's not going, oh, buck up, but they're going, I get it. Just that, without even any cure, just knowing that someone understands. It's such a relief, isn't it? So from our side, when we go through traumatic events, then we are more able to help others through it, and they will trust us because they know it's not just a theory, it's not just something we've made up for a book, but it actually comes from our own experience. So grief and sadness in a way can be useful. They have a use or a purpose. And there was actually a study I read in the New Yorker magazine where they asked people, who were going through the grieving process, someone close to them had died. And they asked, would you rather go through the grieving process, or would you rather take a pill and feel now how you're going to feel like in a year's time? Just avoid the grieving process. And everybody said, no, I want to go through the grieving process. So, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it? To say, no, I want to suffer. But it's because we see there is a purpose in grief where the person was worth it. We're honoring them. We're thinking about them. They had an important, meaningful life, and it's important to acknowledge that. And so whether that hurts or not, that is part of it. So when we bring some meaning to it, then it becomes bearable. In fact, it becomes something that we want to do, to go through, rather than something that we're averse to. So it's quite a different feel to it, grief, sadness, and it can be a community thing, and it'll bring us together. But what happens, of course, with depression, we may have the same experience, but instead of it opening our heart, if we become self-focused, neurotic, it's all about me, I feel bad, grief and illness can sometimes bring out the worst in people. So we had someone here recently who, I asked, oh, how are you? And they said, oh, I've had a terrible year. Don't ask me about it. I've had a terrible year. And I just kind of said, yeah, well, we've all had a terrible year, COVID and everything. And they were like, oh, yeah, but nah. Oblivious. Like their year, because they broke their wrist and because they were isolated, it was bad. And so really oblivious to other people. Why are we oblivious and run roughshod over others? Because we start focusing on our own suffering and getting really neurotic about it, instead of letting it open our heart. And that results in depression. Instead of becoming a better person, becoming more and more inward focused like that, we become emotionally stagnant. So we don't grow. We don't become stronger or be able to share with others, we actually kind of slow everything down to a stop. And because of our self-focused neurotic state of mind, then we start to feel alienated. We start to feel alone, disconnected from society, like nobody cares, like there is no help. And this is just not true. I mean, the fact that we have society, the fact that we are able to be mostly safe in our own homes, that we have homes, you know, this is from the kindness of others, just the baseline kindness of human beings. So this feeling of alienation, we start to believe it as true when it's completely out of step with things. And that feeling of alienation's very debilitating. It's a terrible cycle to get into. And I've been in that when I've been poor and cold, I've begun to feel really alienated. And you get tighter and tighter and more within. Other people around us who care about us are really distressed and we don't notice. If you've ever lived with someone who has depression, they are oblivious to how much their heaviness upsets others, how much others really want to help them and there's no way in because they're completely closed off. So it's not just one person who's suffering depression, it's everyone around them that also is suffering, wanting to help and unable to. So, you know, we're oblivious to that. And when we think about it, who wants to be oblivious? And then the main thing that drives it is this thought, depression has no benefit. So this is the difference, you know, with grief and sadness, we can see how it makes our life meaningful and somehow poignant and rich. It's part of the fabric of life. It's part of connecting us to humanity. Whereas depression, somehow we put it in this box because we can't see where the benefit is, or we feel it's illegitimate, or we're disconnected, then we think there's no use to it. And because we think there's no use, then we don't want it. And when we push against it and don't want it, what happens? It gets bigger. So actually, there is another neurological fact that is quite shocking, which is that the feeling of depression as it arises, if you don't engage with it, it will naturally fall away. It will naturally diminish in strength. And the whole cycle, if you can hold out for about 90 seconds, so a minute and a half, without engaging in that feeling of depression, and that means without going, no, I don't want to feel it, it will naturally dissipate. But what happens is within that 90 seconds, we kick in and we go, no, I don't like it. I don't want it. It's no good. And we've engaged with it. And that makes it stronger. To the extent that we can have depression for years. And as that cycle becomes stronger and tighter, it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. So the Buddha has some radical cures for depression. Lama Zopa Rinpoche shared these radical cures in this book, Ultimate Healing. So there's a section here at the back on dealing with depression. And also in Kathleen McDonald's book, How to Meditate, there's a whole section of dealing with negative energy that's very, very useful. And the other one that's really good is this one, Buddhism for Dummies, which is just one of my all-time favorites. And they're in some of the teachings on the Four Noble Truths. It's really good stuff about depression and anxiety. But this is some of the radical cures, 3 radical cures from the Buddha for depression. And so the first one, to actually remember impermanence and death. So this is what Lama Zopa Rinpoche says. Remember that your death will definitely happen, but that when it will happen is uncertain. This life is very short. It lasts just a minute, just a second. So rather than thinking that you won't die for a long time, think that you might suddenly die today. So this is quite extraordinary, because often, you know, when we're really depressed, we may even have suicidal thoughts. But underneath that impetus, that suicidal thought, is this total feeling that we won't die. You know, that we're stuck, that we're here forever. So underneath a suicidal thought is this grasping at permanence, and that's actually out of step with reality. So strangely enough, you know, in societies where there is a lot of war, civil war, or, you know, external war, violence like that, suicidal thoughts go way, way, way down, because it's much more immediate. You either live or you die, and it's uncertain what will happen. So that thought of, I just want to end it all, and that diminishes. You don't have suicidal thoughts. You're just really happy that you're still alive, even though it's terrible circumstances. So to take the pressure off, if we actually remember, hey, you know, I don't know if I'm going to die. What if I do die today? Then suddenly we go, no, not ready. You know, so that's one thing, to recognize those thoughts and to look underneath them. The other is impermanence, that even though it feels all encompassing, there is no way depression can last forever because of impermanence. So in this instance, impermanence is our friend. So this too will pass. And if we come near to death, depression vanishes. And many Western approaches to depression, many self-help groups, that's the main thing that really helps people, is for others there to say, I know what you're going through, I've been there, and it does pass. And even though everything in your being is saying not possible, I feel it's going to go on forever, there's a living example of someone that it has passed. So that skill of being able to not believe what our feelings tell us. And next week we'll go into a lot more in depth of how to do that. So that's the first one, you know, remember impermanence and death. Actually, you know, walk along with death on your shoulder, and it puts everything else into perspective. The second one, and this is where the Buddhist psychology adds something else. Instead of this too shall pass, it adds an extra bit, which is experience your depression for others. Do it for others. Lama Zopa Rinpoche says to think of it, this is not my depression. It's not all about me. I'm going to do this on behalf of everybody. If I'm going to have to go through depression, I'm going to make it worthwhile. I'm going to do it for everybody. And Rinpoche actually even goes so far as to say, enjoy your depression by voluntarily taking it on behalf of others. So instead of our depression shutting us down, we can use it to recognize the suffering of others, because, you know, like I said before, we don't actually even notice other people are suffering until we do. We don't notice other people suffer from illness until we have one. We don't, you know, we don't even understand what people experience with a headache until we've had one. So we can take that and run with it. So Rinpoche says, A second technique for dealing with depression, and the best way to make your depression beneficial, is to use it to generate the loving, compassionate thought of bodhicitta. In this way, you transform your problem of depression into happiness, and you use it to bring happiness to all living beings. Your depression becomes a path to enlightenment. So part of that is having the courage to open your heart. I really like that thought, not my depression, not mine, because it just kind of releases that neurotic thought and I can open up to others. And as we know, if we do something for somebody, it becomes much easier. So people run marathons to raise money, don't they? Or, you know, mothers go through so much to raise their children. And it's not like a whole lot of that stuff is fun. They're not doing that because they like changing dirty nappies or cooking interminable meals or getting people to places on time. It's not like there's a section of society that loves doing that stuff. No, it's that you're doing it for somebody. And so all of that horrendous, mundane rubbish becomes meaningful, purposeful, because you're doing it for others. So here we are with our depression. We can use it. We can experience it for others, and it becomes highly meaningful. So in this book, is it in here? Yes. So from Buddhism for Dummies, keep in mind that even suffering can have its good points. Sometimes when things are going along relatively smoothly for you, you can more easily ignore the difficulties of others. But when you yourself encounter these same difficulties, you're more likely to open your heart and experience empathy. As your heart opens, your loving compassion also grows stronger. If you can use your difficulties to help generate genuine and deeply felt compassion for others, one of the most beautiful and liberating of all spiritual qualities, then your suffering was definitely worthwhile. And, you know, we can think of so many great historical figures around the world that have done this. They've transformed their extreme suffering circumstances into social change, into amazing education programs, into, you know, the alleviation of racism. All of this kind of thing comes from people transforming their suffering. So it could definitely be useful. Okay, so then the last one, give it to your ego. And I love this one too, because, you know, I have this urge to blame, you know, it's your fault or it's your fault. Whose fault is it? It's certainly not my fault. So then you go, okay, if you're going to blame, you've got to put the blame in the right place. And what's to blame? It's your ego. It's not you. It's not your best self. It's not your nascent fledgling trying to be a good person. No, it's not that. It's the ego, which is not you. They're to blame. So point the finger at the ego with great glee. And this is really interesting because usually when we say, oh, it's all my fault, who's the me that we're referring to then? It's usually the really good one, the vulnerable one, the one trying to be a good human being. It's never, oh, it's all my fault, the afflictive emotions, the jealousy, the pride. So see how we get it wrong? So we can't point at our best self and go, it's your fault. We've got to point at the ego, which is, in psychological terms, the neurotic self-pity me. That's the one that's ruined our life. That's the one that gets us off course. That's the one out of step with reality. It's the internal bully. Terrible. Point the finger. So what makes me harm others and what harms me is my ego. Regard the ego as 1,000,000 times more harmful than a terrorist. It's internal terrorist, you know, and so tricky, so ingrained. So if we can recognize those afflictive emotions, you know, they're distorted ways that we view the world and we respond, attachment, craving, lust, hatred, resentment, jealousy, pride, all of those things. So they're those afflictive emotions that drive depression, and we point the finger at them. And underneath them is your best self, you know, really trying and hampered. And so, of course, we're depressed because that's evidence that something's not right. So the question that we can have here then that we can ask ourselves is, well, this is the litmus test that I kind of give myself. How interested am I in the welfare of others? And I think in the homework, there is this question on a ratio of 1 to 10, how interested am I in the welfare of other people? And you just got to be really honest with yourself. And usually when you're feeling really down, they don't figure it all. It's like, oh, maybe 1 out of 10 is my focus on how other people are feeling. When we're really depressed, we hardly ever ask, how are you going? We hardly ever notice that other people may actually even be more in a worse way than we are. So if I just ask myself this question, then I go, uh-oh, and then I try and shift that focus away from me, the pity me, which is like a neither here nor there kind of thing, and shift it either to how are other people going? Definitely there are some people that are better off than me, for sure, but definitely there are some people that are worse off. And that also connects us back again with everybody. And the self-pity me, you know, don't mix that up with the vulnerable you. It's quite different. The self-pity me is quite selfish and oblivious to others, whereas the vulnerable you know, that's all of our genuine good qualities, our genuine natural kindness and compassion that is there if we don't have the distortions of the afflictive emotions. So that's kind of the summary of the depression and the Buddha's 3 radical cures for depression. What questions or comments do we have before we go on? How does that sit with you? Christy, yes.
I'm uncertain what to think of all this. I'm a biologist, and like many biologists, I find myself grieving nearly every day because I see the earth dying around me. I mean, I see it. I don't seem to have any of these symptoms of depression. I could distress those around me, but I try to keep everything that I see to myself because I don't want to hurt them. But as for grief, having an end, time heals all wounds. It's a grieving process. Be useful. None of this is applying. The earth is.
No, well, in terms of the earth, you're right, it doesn't apply. And in terms of the earth, it is a terrible, terrible situation that we're in. And grieving doesn't even cut the beginning of it. So in terms of, say, when a person dies, then there is a process that we go through. And if we get stuck in that process, it can turn into depression instead of us come out the other side. But in terms of the earth, I'm really glad you brought this up because this is also what we can look at in terms of anxiety and stress. But, you know, in Australia, they notice that there's a whole lot of teenagers that are really concerned about the state of the planet and quite anxious and quite depressed about it. And the answer, our society's answer to that was to start a self-help group about how to overcome anxiety and depression, like how to stop the anxiety and depression. I mean, I can't even think.
No,
How ridiculous
if
is
you
that?
see the earth dying every day, you see species suffering.
That's right.
and-
So the thing is, our whole society goes, let's just stop you feeling bad about that.
Right.
So that is the response of our society, and I've never seen it so clearly as with that. Whereas, you know, actually what we should be doing isn't having self-help groups of how to not feel anxious or depressed. We should be having activist groups. We should be doing something to save the planet. We should be doing each of those little things that we can do that all add up, that cumulatively make a huge difference. But that's it in a nutshell, our response. Our response in Australia has been, let's just help these teenagers, let's just medicate them, you know, problem solved. And as a society, this is the expression of this deep-seated reactivity to thinking that grief, depression, and anxiety are bad. And this is the example. No, actually, they're a legitimate response to traumatic events.
Well, and it should drive me to do activist things. Unfortunately, I'm rather severely disabled. There's not much I can do except think, and I'm writing this book.
Yeah, well, writing, Christy, there is a huge amount that you can do, and it's really one person at a time. So I experienced this from when a friend of mine was going to vote for a political party that was all for coal mining. And, you know, I instead of just going off my bean, which I could quite easily do, I sat down and he just had a baby, right? They just got a new baby in the family. And I'm like, you know, what about the future of this child? Like, what kind of future do you want? You know, about the climate change and the extreme heat waves and the pollution in the air. And he just hadn't put it together that, oh, I could vote for this party that's all for coal mining, that's going to be really good for my business and for the taxation of my business, or I could vote for this party that's about actually sustainable caring for the environment, and I don't necessarily agree with their taxation policy. And because we actually sat down, had some cheesecake, had a cup of tea, we talked about his baby and how much he loved his baby, an amazing thing happened. He emailed me after the election and said, you know what, Miffy, I voted for that party, for the Greens. So this is how we've got to do it.
So you're a little person, so you do a little thing, and that's okay.
Yes, because that makes a big difference, because it changes people's behavior. And this is what does it, education, person by person. This is what the Buddha did as well. And it makes a huge difference, because once you just get a few people changing, then society changes. It changes the tone of the conversation by merely speaking it in that way. So don't underestimate. And remember, from a Buddhist point of view, karma is expandable. So what you do, unless someone actively puts a stop to it, what you do expands naturally. What's put on social media expands naturally. So there's a huge power there. Don't underestimate your power. What we've got to be really develop, and why we need those 3 higher trainings, is to be patient and kind while doing it. And that means person to person. That's the way to do it. So it doesn't matter whether you can leave the house or not, doesn't matter. It's just friendship, person to person. And this is how, again, in studies, stories in the New Yorker magazine, there was, one guy who was kind of communicating on social media with kind of like a right-wing Christian lady. And she was anti-black and anti-gay and anti-everything. And so he just started having a conversation with her. And over the years, they kind of became friends rather than alienating each other. And they actually met at a demonstration where she was demonstrating anti-abortion or something or other, I don't know. And he was there, and he went, "Oh, you're so-and-so." Hello, so good to see you. And like everything changed because it comes from the person. So actually she ended up, because of that human caring and contact and then slow education, she ended up actually becoming a social activist herself. So the thing that happens that we can often think is not fair somehow is that why is it the oppressed that have to make the first step? Why is it the victims that have to be big-hearted and help the oppressor? But that's how it is. And actually, we can do it because we're the ones that we've been experiencing this. We have the big-heartedness of it. If you're a privileged, entitled class, you've got no resilience, completely dependent on circumstances.
It's true.
That's why there's so much fear and tightness. So actually, by being the victim, being the oppressed, being the weak one, there is a huge amount of inner strength that comes from that. And anyone in an oppressed environment, if you can marshal that inner strength, then you can really make big changes in the world. And Christy, I read articles from biologists and climate people and scientists and this and that, and I see the incredible heartache and sadness about what's going on. But they just keep on saying it how it is. They keep on educating. They keep on saying, like Greta Thunberg, it's not too late. There are things, but we have to do them now. So psychologically, they're very clever in how they present it. And you can only do that if you're not depressed.
Oh,
and
point taken.
I think the depression comes from when we feel powerless. But actually, if we've got that inner strength to recognize what's going on and just feel sad, just grieve for the world, then we keep our energy. So it really means being big-hearted. And as a Buddhist, there's another layer on all of this, because not only this wonderful planet is dying, and not only are we reaching so many tipping points, but this planet is the support for a perfect human rebirth. Without this planet, we don't have a perfect human rebirth, and then we have no chance of enlightenment. So it's a whole other layer that is in danger.
Well, thanks for that.
So it's imperative that we do everything that we possibly can. So important. And honestly, just changing the conversation. I've noticed in my classes, like I talk about climate change and I talk about this, and I know half the class just thinks climate change is a bunch of rubbish. Half the class, but at least by talking about it, you legitimize the conversation. So just that has an effect. It really, really does. The airtime. So yes, I'm really glad you brought that up, Christy, because that's a big point. And in terms of what causes depression, that is a response to distressing circumstances. It's a legitimate thing. So it's legitimate to be sad. Don't even let it get to the depression part. We can just cry about it and then get up in the morning and do some more. So it leads on to the next thing, which is anxiety or fear. And so, like I was saying about these teenagers with this deep-seated anxiety about their future, and our society's response to just drug them, to just distract them, to say it's not that bad, don't worry about it, all of those things, rather than actually, like how people treat Greta Thunberg, instead of actually listening to her. So the difference between anxiety and fear. So fear, it's unpleasant. It's a thing we don't like to feel, but it can accurately reflect a situation because it can keep us safe. So we need a sense of fear to stay alive. If you're fearless, you're going to get into all sorts of accidents. You're going to do really stupid things. Like they say, you know, teenagers, especially teenage boys from about, you know, from puberty onwards to about the mid-20s are actually insane with their hormones. They have no fear. And that's why there's so many accidents, so many ill-advised things are done because there isn't a sense of fear. So actually fear is our friend. It's important that when you're crossing a 16-lane highway, you have some sense of fear, that you're aware where the cars are. So we can get that. It's not pleasant, but it's important. Now, anxiety. Anxiety is an out of proportion response to a situation that we see as negative or has no benefit. So anxiety, how we distinguish it between the fear is that there's something out of kilter about it. And so, for instance, when people say they're anxious about climate change, is that an out of proportion response? I'd say no. I'd say that is legitimate fear. But what happens if we dwell upon it, if we ruminate, if we exaggerate that, or if we exaggerate how powerless we are, thinking we can't do anything, then it becomes a habit. Then it becomes anxiety driven and it becomes debilitating. So, you know, we have fight, flight, or freeze. So anxiety can end up freezing us, becoming very enclosed and debilitated. Now, there is something here that, again, because we're dominated by our worldly concerns, we don't like anxiety and we don't like fear because they are unpleasant emotions. But actually, if we start investigating what's happening, what do they feel like, they're actually neutral. So the thing that I wanted to read you about this one from Kathleen McDonald, how to meditate. So fear. In traditional Buddhist explanations of the delusions or the disturbing emotions, the afflictive mind states, fear is not usually mentioned, but it is a common cause of unhappiness and stress. Fear is not necessarily negative. It depends on what we're afraid of and how we handle our fears. It can, in fact, be useful in our everyday life as well as in our spiritual practice. Fear of hurting ourselves and others in a car accident motivates us to drive carefully and observe the rules of the road. Fear of disease and an early death motivates us to eat wisely and take care of our health. Fear of a negative, out of control state of mind at the time of death motivates us to prepare ourselves for death by developing a spiritual practice. Fear of the painful consequences of negative actions motivates us to refrain from creating bad karma and act compassionately. Nevertheless, fear can bring negative results. It disturbs our peace of mind. It can harm our health. It causes us to see things in a mistaken way. And it can motivate us to act irrationally or destructively. So it is something that we should aim to overcome. One of the qualities of an enlightened mind is being free of all fears. So, you know, the Tara practice, of course, you know, Tara, freeing from all fears, all anxieties, but it doesn't mean getting rid of the feeling of anxiety. It means freeing from the causes of the fear. Now, there's something else too, and this is about stress. So actually, stress is good for us. Stress can be a good thing. And in fact, we need stress, and I'll tell you why. So we have this cognitive fusion that's operating, which is it feels bad, therefore it is bad. So if we're stressed about the world, we're stressed about our job, stressed about our family, we think the stress is the problem because it feels bad, it's disturbing us, and cognitive fusion mixes that together. But even though stress is not pleasant, it is essential because human beings need intermittent stress to grow and develop strength. Now, this is just physically, right? So physically, you might think, say, the life of an astronaut, for instance, they're out there in the space station and they don't even have to drag themselves out of bed. They just float out of bed, you know, zero gravity. Woo, how excellent. Perfect. But then have you noticed when they come back to Earth, they actually have to carry them in their chair from out of the satellite when it's landed. So they're not carrying them because it's a procession. They're carrying them in their astronaut's chair because they have no muscle mass left and they cannot actually stand up. They've come back to Earth, and because they've been living in zero gravity, their muscles have atrophied, even with all of the exercises that they do. So they come back, they've lost bone density and they have no muscles. They cannot even sit up by themselves. So here we are on the planet, we're walking around and all the time we are fighting against gravity. We're experiencing stress against gravity all the time. And that's why we have strong bones, and that's why we have muscles. And that's why we're all sitting up here today instead of flat on our back, through stress training. So stress is a good thing. We need it. But what we need is a specific type of stress. And just like if you're doing weight training, you don't just do 16 hours of weight training and then stop. You'll break something. What you need is stress, rest, stress, rest. And that's what we need in our emotional life. Challenge, respite. Difficulties, problems, unhappiness, and then a safe place to process it. If we don't have those, we'll have no resilience. So you just look at, you know, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant young male, the entitled classes, you know, actually they're growing up totally debilitated because everything there is coming easily and you think it's you. And then when one of those things falls away, so you have an injury, you lose your job, you get old, you get divorced, suddenly there's no resilience to cope with it. It's why we have culture shock. We go to another culture and suddenly people aren't treating us the way that we're accustomed to. So that comes because we have no resilience. And how do we get resilience? It's from stress. So here we're trying to, you know, we grow our kids up, trying to shield them from all suffering and stress. And one of the things that we do is we shield children from illness and death. And I know I have friends here who have never come across a dead body, never known anyone who's died, never had that kind of experience. And then in their early 30s, their dog who they've lived with for 12 years dies. And now this is, you know, you're 30 and this is your first experience of loss. And so, you know, my dear friend, she had a nervous breakdown because that was her first experience of it. No practice throughout her whole life. It had been really good. So cognitive fusion thinks feels good is good, feels bad is bad. It's totally wrong. You know, so kids that grow up with loss or their pets dying or somebody close to them dying or a bushfire losing their house, it's incredibly traumatic, but it makes you a stronger person. So with the bushfires here in a few years ago down south in Australia, you know, they did a study because there were whole towns and communities that were just razed to the ground. You know, they're completely silent. There's no wildlife, no birds, nothing. And they're really worried about the mental health of all of these kids, you know, and they got the community together and started kind of a school of the air for a while. And what they found was the kids that actually came from backgrounds poorer, maybe single parent, maybe unemployed, quite what you call disadvantaged backgrounds, they bounced back much quicker. And the ones that came from 2-parent households, 2 cars, you know, nice, wonderful, stable family, they were really traumatized for years. So there you go. You know, we can really do ourselves a disservice by thinking that the difficult things are to be avoided because we need them. And we need to be able to go through difficulties with support. So like the intermittent stress, we need to have whatever difficulties come, embrace them and work through them in this healthy way. So resilience is the ability to voluntarily bear suffering, to take it on instead of fight against it, which makes it worse, turns it into depression, and then profit from the situation. Working against cognitive fusion, the thing that we can do is just to remind ourselves, feeling is not fact. So how we feel, it's legitimate, but it's not true. So it doesn't mean that you gaslight someone. You don't shut them down. You recognize, yeah, that feeling, it's debilitating, it's intense, it's overwhelming. It can be so distressing. But you know what? It's not true. What the story it's telling you is not true. So you can relax. We can work with this. There is a way that we can benefit from it. In fact, this is the only way that we get strong. We don't get strong by being those astronauts. So then there's just some, in the time that we've got left, just some little tips for how to break this habit of worry. And where do we go? Okay, so one of them, mindfulness, to notice when we're getting agitated, to actually become kind of embodied. Notice our breathing, notice our temperature, notice the posture. So be aware of it before it runs away with us. So I must admit, when I'm in a bad way, the way I notice is I start dropping things, crashing into the furniture or bumping my head. It's like, I'm a bit discombobulated today. Slow down. Start looking within. What's the state of play? What's my internal state like? So mindfulness, being aware, this is the point of it, is to become connected again. Identify your feeling tone without being overwhelmed by it. Identify, I woke up with depression today. You know, don't let the depression upset you. It's me and my depression. So aware. Woke up a bit impatient today. Okay, I've got to slow things down and be kinder to others and myself. How do we even start that? By this ability of reflection, mindfulness. Another one for breathing and for anxiety in particular is breathing, is to consciously change the rhythm of your breathing to much more out breath, much slower, much less in breath. So breathing out for 6, in for 4. Breathe out for 6, in for 4. This is also when you're, if you have insomnia, for instance, when you're going to sleep, you have a much longer out breath, much shorter in breath, because that's mimics how you breathe when you're asleep. And it will calm your nervous system down, and that will help your mind to calm down. Also, meditations like 9-round breathing are very helpful as well. cut out dietary extremes, sugar, caffeine, alcohol. Oh my gosh. So we know about how much poison sugar is, or at least if you have the sugar crash, to know it's not you and it'll pass. Caffeine too, though, can really exacerbate anxiety. And for years, I thought I was agoraphobic, but I tell you what, a lot of it was to do with just going to a coffee shop and drinking way too much coffee and being really shy and not being able to leave. So then just having more coffee. And, you know, I thought it was this deep, meaningful thing happening, but actually a whole lot of it was the caffeine and alcohol as well. Alcohol, you know, I'd drink myself to sleep, but then I couldn't sleep for more than 2 or 3 hours and I'd wake up again in a panic. So then I'd drink, and I didn't put 2 and 2 together, that alcohol actually creates anxiety after a while. So dietary extremes, unless your mind is so strong, they're very difficult to withstand. So that's the place really to start. Do it for others. Whatever we experience, we can do it for my people. You know, so when you know, Christy, when you start feeling so upset about the state of the world, hold that for all the other biologists. Do it for them. You know, you're big-hearted enough that you can go through this experience for them, and then whenever needed, you'll be ready. You won't shy away. You'll know how to encourage others. They're your people, so that's where you start with. You go through the experience, that richness of that experience, for them. Write a list. So instead of catastrophizing late at night with insomnia, which just gets worse and worse and bigger and bitter, turn on the light and write a list of all the things that you're worried about, all the terrible things that can happen. And this is in the worksheet. Write them down, capture them with words, and then one thing that you can do about each thing. There's always one thing, even if it's tiny, even if it's donating $1 to a wildlife fund, or even if it's just talking to your granny or your right-wing friend or whatever in a nice way. There's one thing that we can do, and you write that down for every single thing that you're worried about. And it'll take the pressure off, and then the next morning you'll know where to start. Now this one's a little bit more in depth, which is the main cause of anxiety in particular comes from seeking satisfaction from external conditions. It is the dissatisfied mind of desire that is the main cause of stress. And we get ourselves into a vicious cycle because we try and alleviate that stress by getting more or changing our external circumstances, thinking if I get a better job or if I have more and more, and then that just creates more stress and more worry. So actually it's to slow the whole process down and recognize it's this craving for things, for external satisfaction, for things to be different, for circumstances to change. That is the source of stress, that craving. Circumstances can be quite difficult, but what makes us distressed and agitated is our craving. So a very simple way to start with this is to stop seeking satisfaction from external conditions. Doesn't mean we stop trying to change things, but that's our first port of call, isn't trying to change those external conditions. It's to look within. And then have the courage to listen to your anxiety, because your anxiety is actually got a legitimate message. You know, most of the things that we're anxious about are not out of proportion. We just get into this cycle of worry. So I have this this little joke, you know, of someone who went off to the dentist and said, "Oh, look, You know, my teeth were fine. My teeth were perfectly okay until my dentist pointed out they were full of cavities. So, you know, that's really how we are, isn't it? You know, we think everything's fine until boof, it just gets in our face, and then we blame the messenger. We blame the dentist. But actually, you know, and like now we've got lockdown, and so everyone's demonstrating against the government for lockdown. Like, it's not the government, it's COVID. So what our anxiety does is we kind of blame the messenger. So instead, listen to our anxiety. It's not the anxiety that's the problem. Actually, the anxiety shows us exactly where to look. The anxiety is our friend. And then we can really investigate, where is it pointing to? And it's going to be different for all of us. And then we're mature human beings, we have the wealth of the Dharma behind us, then we can do something about it. So there really is a message in there. And until we listen to that wisdom in the anxiety, it will keep going, it will get worse. And a lot of the wisdom in the anxiety is just pointing out our mortality. We are going to die and we don't know when. And so instead of just being anxious about it, to recognize this is actually how things are. So what do I need to do to make that okay? Who do I have to say sorry to? What do I have to change in my life? What are the things that really matter that I'm not spending time doing? Rather than just trying to squish the anxiety down. Our anxiety actually points out where we're out of track. So, and there was one last thing that I'm not sure is on there to do, particularly with worry, that whenever you're doing any form of an analysis or even writing a list like that, to change your posture so you're mimicking someone who is relaxed and at ease. So sit back in the chair and open up the whole chest and heart area. Put your hands by your sides and mimic being at ease. And then start writing a list. And your whole posture change, your whole frame of mind will change just from changing your posture. So in summary, depression and anxiety are signs you're out of step with your best self. So they're signs that something's wrong. They're an indication that you're already trying to heal yourself. And while we don't listen, they will always come back. That's why they keep coming back, because we haven't actually listened to that inner wisdom. So they're not that something is wrong with us. We're just out of step with reality. We're out of step with our best self. Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, the fever of your depression can be a path to compassion. So our depression can lead to empathy for others, and that can lead to compassion, this wish to help oneself and to help others. And this is the way we heal the world. Without it, there is no compassion. We need our stress to become strong and resilient. We need it ideally in little intermittent bite-sized chunks and build it up as we build up weight training. So next time you have a little stressful situation, go, goody, goody, goody. This is my boot camp. It's okay, I can do it. And both anxiety and depression are the first signs of healing, of your qualities and your wisdom trying to break through. So we can end with this kind of thought that if we have anxiety and depression, that's evidence of your Buddha nature trying to burst through. It's a good sign. So the homework, try to listen, try to develop this inner listening. to the hidden wisdom in your suffering and do it for others. And who, so think of who your people are, start there and then slowly expand it out. But try and identify your people, the ones that you just naturally feel for, and do it for them. And then we'll dedicate the merits now, but next week we're going to have a look at the toxic habit cycle of depression and anxiety, how it forms and how we can deconstruct it. So how we can take it apart bit by bit, which is totally different from pushing it down, suppressing. It's actually deconstructing negative habits so they're no longer there. So we're actually free of them. So it's not just willpower. So as usual, we've run out of time again. So thank you so much for your attention and attendance and your courage in coming along and talking about these things and sharing. And let's dedicate that. May we have that big-heartedness and courage. May we develop all of our wisdom from our difficulties. May they become really useful. May they become our fuel to be able to heal ourselves and heal the world. And not just that, but liberate ourselves and then liberate all sentient beings by becoming a fully enlightened Buddha, becoming our best self, bringing that potential to its fullest. And then we'll be able to effortlessly, spontaneously, and perfectly help all others. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of the week. See you next week.
Thank you,